Sure. Let me just dive straight into it.
Please wait, I am the host and let me host the event at least.
Wait,
Okay.
wait. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hearty good evening to one and all. I welcome you all to the Terra Incognita, the annual paper presentation event by Department of History, DCAC. I am Riya Gupta from BA History Honours, and today I will be the host for this event. Before proceeding, I would like to remind our candidates of the time limit. Each will be allotted 20 minutes to present their paper and then 5 minutes to answer the questions from the audience. Audience is expected to type their question in the chat box, which will be addressed later by the speaker. Okay, beginning on with our first presentation, we have with us Ritvik Chaturvedi, who is a graduate in history from DCAC, currently pursuing his PhD at Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru. Ritvik will be shedding light on the very interesting topic, which is domestication of apples. Ritvik, please.
Okay, sure. Um, you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So thanks for the introduction. It was um, too flattering for me. I'll just dive straight into it. I'll attempt to map the trajectories of the domesticated apple and other perennial crops, and I mean, of course, how they were domesticated, and also briefly discuss the anthropological and social background to the story of apple evolution. Most fruits that we eat today come from primarily two classes, the Magnoliopsida and the Liliopsida, and are distributed across as many as 8 orders or maybe more. Apple belongs to the Rosaceae family, which comes from the Magnoliopsida class. Um, I've highlighted it here. I think you should be able to see it. This is a good revision for your ninth class biology from your biology textbook. Um, Most fruits that we eat today were domesticated in Central Asia and the Middle East, like apples, olives, date palms, watermelons. Apple has wild relatives in South Asia, China, and Europe as well. As is evident from this slide, fruits were domesticated much after grasses. It was because perennial arboreal crops have lengthy juvenile phases that act as deterrents to domestication. If you can see Triticum, I'm not sure, can you see my cursor here?
No, we can't. Your slides are not
Actually,
moving.
you have not put it in presentation mode. I think the slides are still in the PowerPoint presentation. Like,
Oh, I'm so
you can
sorry.
start the
I'm so sorry.
presentation. Uh,
Wait.
yeah, put it in the full mode.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that. Wait, you know what? I think I'll just share my entire screen. Um, I think now you should be able to see it.
Yeah, it's perfect now.
Now we can.
Were you able to see this slide?
No, like right now it's
Okay.
visible.
Okay, you should have just told me. Anyway, so I was essentially mapping the taxonomy of apple and other Rosaceae plants. And other Rosaceae plants, I think watermelon is also a Rosaceae plant, but I'll have to check. Don't take my word for it. Anyway. I'll come back to this slide later on if anyone's interested. Most fruits, as I said, were domesticated in Central Asia and the Middle East. Apple has wild relatives in South Asia, China, Europe, and apple is a self-incompatible plant. It cannot fertilize itself. Uh, and this posed a problem in early breeding efforts until vegetative propagation and grafting came along. And if you can see, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Latin names, Triticum is wheat, Oryza sativa is rice, Hordeum vulgare is barley. These three grasses were domesticated fairly early on. Vitis vinifera, which is grapes. This is, can you see my cursor? Pomegranates, almonds, dates, olives,
Yeah.
apple, walnuts, figs, and apricots. They were domesticated much later in history because of this very reason. They have really long juvenile phases. There are four main wild progenitors of the apple: the Sivasi, the Silvestris, Orientalis, and Baccata. Sivasi occurs in the Tian Shan mountain ranges of Central Asia. That also happen to be the native habitat of wild progenitors of other common fruits like apricots, pears, pomegranates, cherries, walnuts. Silvestris occurs in Western and Central Europe and occurs largely at the edges of forests, for it has a high light requirement. There's a little bit of overlap in the native ranges of Orientalis and Baccata, the former occurring in Turkey, Georgia, South and West Russia, and the latter in Siberia and South Asia. This slide, oops, yeah. So, I mean, this is essentially a crude representation of the native habitats of some of the wild progenitors. Um, the history behind this is that Silvestris survived in a few pockets in southern Europe during the last glacial maxima, which was 11,000, roughly 11, 12,000 years back. What happened during the last glacial maxima was that the sea level was really low and a lot of parts of Western Central Europe were just under ice, under snow. And there were a few pockets that were not, which are known as glacial refugia. When the last glacial maxima got over and the Holocene started 10,000 years back, these plants that managed to survive in these few pockets in these refugia managed to recolonize parts of Northern Europe when the climate warmed up. This led to accompanying admixtures, populations mixed up, and disconnected populations. Populations that were disconnected earlier were later on connected. For Sivasi, two distinct populations have been identified, one spread in Central Asia and one narrowly distributed in the Tian Shan Mountains. Orientalis shows three distinct populations in Armenia, Turkey, and South. I mean, I'm not sure if it's not a very good map. I'm sorry for that. We observe largely three changes as part of the domestication syndrome in apple. One is the loss in bitterness, which cannot be observed archaeologically. The other is loss in dioecy. Loss in dioecy means that the plant has male individuals and female individuals. But evolutionarily speaking, when a plant transitions from dioecy to monoecy, we see a rise in hermaphroditism, which means there are no male or female individuals. Both the male and female reproductive parts are present on the same individual. And of course, we see a change in the seed size or seedlessness. The problem with this is that traits are not clearly visible. These traits are not clearly visible in the archaeological record. So the only signature that is visible in the archaeological record is seed size. And this is actually an example showing olives and mango. This mango is from somewhere, this is the wild mango, the domesticated mango. And what happens when the seed becomes longer and thinner, plant metabolism or fruit metabolism diverts more nutrition to the plant flesh that humans eat. So it benefits us because it gives us more flesh to eat. There's a close evidence between nuclear DNA and chloroplast DNA. If you want, I can go into the details of what they mean. And between the Sivasi and the Domestica varieties, and the close relationship between the nuclear and chloroplast DNA between these two varieties, such as the Sivasi is the closest relative of Malus domestica. However, studied on microsatellite markers are essentially portions of the DNA that keep on repeating for quite a long base pair distance. So they have shown that Malus domestica forms a distinct panmictic species. Panmictic species is a species that, where we observe random mating between populations. And it's quite different from, based on single sequence repeats or microsatellite markers, we've concluded that Malus domestica is quite different from Sivasi. In fact, recent studies also show that chloroplast DNA of most apple cultivars bear resemblance to Silvestris than to Sivasi, and which is actually contradictory to what I said earlier. And there could be a few possible reasons for this. Although the domesticated apple originated from Malus Sieversii in the Tian Shan mountain ranges around 4000 BCE. It probably traveled westward along the Silk Route in the late first millennium CE and hybridized with other wild populations, most notably with Malus sylvestris. And once out of the Malus sieversii habitat, multiple introgressions from Malus sylvestris populations in Asia effectively erased the genetic imprint of Sieversii. An alternate explanation is also that the populations that contributed to the original germplasm of the cultivated apple, the original Sieversii populations that might have contributed to the current genetic makeup, might have just gone extinct. We don't know. And I mean, as you students of history would know, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. An important thing to realize is that many characteristics of domestication in apples or fruits, like flavor, color, fruit size, reduction in growing time, they're invisible in the archaeological record. There is considerable evidence for the collection of wild apples in Europe across the Neolithic, 8000 BC, and Bronze Age, which is Chalcolithic, 3300 BC. Apple seedlings might have been traded from Central Asia to as far as Northern Ireland. The most credible evidence for horticulture and apple cultivation comes from the 3rd century BCE Greece, from where the knowledge of grafting fruit cultivation was transmitted to Rome. Some ecologists have argued that the presence of isolated patches of large sweet apples amidst larger populations of local bitter apples suggests the early use of apples in Western and Central Asia, because these pockets have been found in Caucasian mountains, Georgia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Turkey. In conclusion, the apple was brought under, I mean, these are the key takeaways, so to speak. The apple was brought under cultivation in Central Asia around anywhere between the 8th and 2nd millennium BCE. This was much later than most cereal grasses because they have lengthy juvenile phases that precluded targeted breeding efforts. Furthermore, Malus spur is a self-incompatible species, an individual that cannot fertilize itself. The history of Malus domestica reconstructed from a variety of uni and biparentally inherited molecular markers. Uniparentally inherited by molecular markers are essentially the Y chromosome, and the in plants it will be the plastid DNA and the chloroplast DNA, and the mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally. Shows that Malus domestica originated from a cluster of Sieversii populations around 10 to 4,000 years back. The development of the Silk Route made the apple come in contact with other apple varieties, undergo rapid human-mediated hybridization in the last 2-3 millennia to make them better suited for newer environments. An overarching takeaway from this presentation should be that, I mean, if there's anything that you want to take away from this, it should be that trajectories of domestication are not always linear. They are quite protracted. There are multiple introgressions, admixtures, and back crossings. And I'll leave you with that. If you have any questions regarding any of the scientific biological jargon that I used, I'm happy to answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Ritvik. Are there any questions, any clarifications? I thought, I was wondering what the paper would entail, but it was interesting, Ritvik, and what you were able to kind of trace. I know there was a lot of science. Okay, Anchit, you have a question. All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Ritvik,
Yeah,
for
I
this.
do.
I have just one question. You mentioned something about this transmission through Silk Route. So, like for me, those scientific jargons are a little difficult to grasp. But there was some, because you mentioned that this kind of exchange through Silk Route, this trading networks had certain impact on the I don't know this biological word, but on the
Admixtures,
on the
genetic.
story on the
Okay.
story of Apple. So can you just tell me a little more about this and story of how these foods kind of how they move from one place to another?
Sure, sure. See, I'm not exactly sure about, I mean, I'll have to go back to the original papers that I read and how they mapped the Silk Route transitions to the genetic evidence, but I can tell you the basic principles behind it. let's say, I mean, you as a human being have a Y chromosome that you get from your father, only from your father, and a mitochondrial DNA that you got only from your mother. Your autosomal DNA, which the non-sex determining chromosomes are biparentally inherited. Half come from your mother and half come from your father, right? But let's say you have two populations that have distinctly different nuclear DNA, but you can see a very similar chloroplast DNA, a very similar Y chromosome DNA. You can see a very similar maternal mitochondrial DNA. Then you can trace that at a certain point in history, uh, females from that population or males from that population had migrated to this population and bred with this other population, or were made to breed in case of plants or animals, domesticated animals. That's number one. Another thing that we can remember is that uh, cytoplasmic DNA, I mean, non nuclear DNA, chloroplast DNA, or mitochondrial DNA, it does not undergo recombination. I mean, it's passed on as it is from one generation to another. And this as it is set, it's known as one haplotype. Why it's known as a haplotype, I can go into that if you want, but it's known as one haplotype or one haplogroup. So once you identify one haplogroup, and because it does not, it is very stable structurally across hundreds, thousands of years. So it's very easy to trace evolution using that. The other method is also that of molecular clocks, because uh, let's say your DNA has 80. I mean, it takes, scientists have estimated that there is a certain time it takes, evolutionarily speaking, for A to be replaced by T, G to be replaced by C. So they trace that back as a clock. Honestly speaking, that concept is a bit fuzzy in my head right now. I'll have to go back and revise it. So that's another technique they use. I mean, I hope that answers your question in terms of like the principles that were applied. The exact statistical tools, I'll have to probably do another presentation for that. Does that answer you?
Like I was not very much concerned about the scientific methodology.
Okay.
I was about like the historical factor of Silk Route. Did
Yeah,
it
I
played
mean,
any role in that sense? Like my concern was more towards this bridging gap of the field of science and history and study of history.
so yes, I mean they corroborate the scientific evidence from whatever written records they have access to. Whatever written records they studied, I don't know what written records they used it up,
Okay,
because this presentation was actually meant for a biology department, so I did not really go very much in that direction.
okay.
But it is well known that the Silk routes played a major role. I mean, you must have studied about the Columbian Exchange.
Yes,
It
yes,
was
yes,
1492. It
yes.
introduced an entire new basket of fruits to, I mean, tomatoes, capsicums, corn, pepper, to, sorry, not pepper, but I mean, I was referring to bell pepper, to the old world. So, I mean, you have written records. That's pretty much as good as it gets. You have old paintings that show a very different kind of watermelon. You have old paintings that show different kinds of apples that can be used as records. But it's not very robust evidence, scientifically speaking, I'm afraid. So that
Thank you
kind of
so much.
evidence is just as good as it gets.
Thank you.
I'm really sorry I couldn't answer your question to your
No, no,
satisfaction.
it's a very interesting point. Thank you.
I know it definitely is interesting how we are linking up, history with so much of scientific jargon and trying to understand. I think I understand what Anchit was trying to say, that the word Silk Route was something that we were all familiar with, So how that kind of get linked up with that. All right, chalo, good.
But
Thank
I
you.
hope you understand like what I was trying to tell you biologically, how
Yes.
you trace it, how you trace migrations in the past, how you trace past hybridization events. You can also check allele. I'm not sure if you're familiar. It's a variant of a gene. So if you have a certain variant of eye color, hair color, fruit color at very high frequencies in one population versus another population, you can probably trace migrations. You can possibly say that there was a migration bottleneck that, I mean, it was a bottleneck that allowed only a certain fraction of that population A to survive and reproduce into population B. It's known as a founder effect. But yeah, sure. I mean, I could take you through over that if you want, but yeah. I mean, I'm not formally trained in biology, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, wow, it was such a pleasure to know more about our beloved apples, right? It is really fascinating to dig deep into the things which we see every day, but has an untold story, right? Thank you so much, Ritvik. That was amazing to hear too. Okay, and next up, I would like to call Chandrama Banerjee. She is an alumni of History Department, DCAC batch of 2018. She has done her master's from National Museum Institute, where she attained distinction with scholarship for excellent academic record. Keen in research and academic, she is exploring her potential in the field of art history. Today, she will be presenting paper on visual representation of Varanasi by William Hodges and Daniels. Ma'am, please. You are on mute.
All right, I forgot. Please don't address me as ma'am. You can call me Sangam. And thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'll just start presenting.
Okay.
Is this visible? Am I visible?
No, no, it's not. It's not. It's not.
No, it's not.
Is that an alpaca or a llama in your profile picture?
Yes. Uh, what is it visible now? I mean,
It is, of course. It is.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it is. Yeah, it's good. It's good.
is my camera on or off? I'm not able to
No,
tell.
it's off. Your camera is off. You're presenting
That's
the screen with the camera off.
yeah. Great. So today I'll be presenting my one of the seminar papers which I submitted during my master. And the topic, as you can see, is the visual representation of Varanasi by William Hodges and Thomas and William Daniels. So, to give a brief history about Varanasi, Varanasi was the capital of the Kashi Janapad, and according to the ancient scriptures, the name Varanasi emerges from its location between the two rivers, that is the Varna and the Athi, which and it is also believed that the Varanasi lies on the top of the Shiva's Trishul, which is the trident, right? And we can find the evidence of Varanasi in various religious and ancient texts, such as in the Agni Puran, Kashi is called the Abhimukh, where the Shiva is still residing there. And even in Mahabharata, uh, the name of Varna is associated with that of Ganga. And it is believed that in between the Ganga and the Gomti River, the Varanasi was established by the king Devodas. We also find evidence of Varanasi in religious and in the Buddhist religious texts, such as the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. It mentions that the body of Buddha was covered in the cloth made in Benares, and the quality was so superior that even oil couldn't possibly stain it. So Varanasi has always been prevalent since the ancient times. Buddha gave his first sermon at Sarnath, whereas Tulsidas wrote Ramcharitmanas at Assi Ghat, which is currently known as the Tulsi Ghat. And it is also the birthplace of Parshvanath, the 23rd Jain Tirthankar. Talking about the economic and the cultural aspects of Varanasi, uh, it was uh, it was a part of the Uttarapath, which is the northern trade route, and the evidence of which is also being mentioned in the Vinay Pitaka. It states that Kashi was a part of the Uttarapath with thriving in materials such as the chandan, cottage and textile industry. Along with that, even Arthashastra mentions the importance of Shrama Vastra during the Mauryan trade. So there were basically two routes, two trade routes, the Uttarapath and the Dakshinapath. During Ashoka's reign in Varanasi, it was called Pothli, like Potli, Pothli, and even in the according to the Kalihand and Ashtadhyaya, it was called Jitavri by traders and merchants in 2nd century BC. So the Uttarapath overseas trade during the Gupta period has been evidenced with the Saptasagara Mohalla and the Saptanagara Puja, which is still being practiced across Varanasi.
Excuse me, Chandrama, sorry to interrupt
Yeah,
you, but your slides are not changing. It's just the
right.
Kashi Ganga
Oh, right,
slide.
right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's good.
I
That's
just I was focused on.
it's okay. It's
Sorry.
okay.
Right. So I said. Right. So this is what I was talking about. This is sort of a map of Varanasi, and you can see the various ghats and the rivers, and yeah, all of these things planned, but I absolutely forgot to change the slide. My bad. Okay. So this is the Uttarapath and the Dakshinapath, which I was talking about. As you can see, the yellow line marks the Dakshinapath. The green line is my arrow visible? Yeah. The green, as you can see, Kashi is here, right? So it falls in this sort of a trade and commercial route, right? So wait. So talking about the archaeological aspects, the recent archaeological investigation in its vicinity dates it back to 1500 BCE. The ancient Varanasi developed in the Rajghat highland area, which was in which we can find the yakshas, yakshinis, and nagas along with the pottery. Right, the credits of the discovery of Rajghat goes to Krishna Deva, who took up trial excavation of the site on behalf of ASI. And you can see these are some of the pictures of the various archaeological evidences, which dates back to 1500 BCE, which helps us date, uh, you know, the site of Varanasi, right? So the ghats, talking about the ghats of Varanasi, as you can see, it forms like a crescent shaped sort of a establishment, which is due to the settlement of the fluvial process and the soil, right? So, I mean, there are like approximately 84 ghats which stretch about 6.8 kilometers in an arch shape. And the five most important ghats, which are called the Panchatirthi, are the Asi Ghat, the Dashashwamedha Ghat, the Manikarnika Ghat, the Panchaganga Ghat, and the Adi Keshava Ghat. So the Panchaganga Ghat, if you can see right here, this is the Panchaganga Ghat, and it's called so because it there's a confluence of the five important tributaries, of the rivers, which is the Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Dhupa, and Kiran. So Kashi also, one of the major aspects of Kashi is that if there's a Panchakoshi pilgrimage which starts and concludes at the Kashi Vishwanath Mandir. Right, so there's an entire grid of Kashi Mandala where pilgrims undertake the Panchakoshi Yatra along with many other yatras called the Chaurashi Yatra, the Nagar Pradakshina Yatra, the Avimukta Yatra, and the Griha Yatra, and all of which, the axis of which is the Kashi Vishwanath Mandir, right? And there has been a lot of development of the ghats, which were initiated by the Peshwas of Pune, the Holkars of Indore, Scindias of Gwalior, and Rani Bhavani of Bengal and kings of Nepal, and so on and so forth. This is just to give you a brief background of Varanasi. As you can see, there are certain pictures of ghats which I took from the internet. I didn't get the time to be there in person, but this is just to show you the setting of the Varanasi and its ghats, which we'll see the representations as I progress. So these are the few pictures of the ghats at present there. So this, before I begin with the representations, I'll try to familiarize you with the aquatint process, since most of the slides which I'll be presenting will be a depiction of aquatints. So just to give you a brief about what aquatint actually is. So it's sort of a printmaking process where you take the copper or the zinc plate as shown here, you apply varnish on it, right? So varnish is acid, it's bite resistant, right? So after you do this, you place it in a rosin dust box. This you place it on the mesh, and there's a spindle here, and you move the spindle to create sort of a rosin dust. You place the plate here as shown, so that once the dust settles, you heat it, right? So after you heat it, it's completely absorbed into the plate. After which the etchings you make, you apply oil or paint on it, and then you immerse it into a nitric solution. And the places where you applied the varnish won't be getting bitten off, and only the places which the oil it's sort of like the places you're not etched, you'll get sort of a shading and a gradation effect. And this is how, and you can repeat these two processes as long as you're not satisfied, and once you are, you can imprint it on a piece of paper. So I'll begin with the European traveler artists. So I'll be focusing on three major artists here. First one is William Hodges, and the other is the duo Thomas and William Daniel. So talking about William Hodges, so William Hodges was born in London in 1744 to a tradesman in St. James. He had been a pupil of Richard Wilson for 7 years, who trained him in the principle of classical idealism. In 1772, he had accompanied Captain James Cook of British Royal Navy on his second voyage to New Zealand as official artist for the Admiralty, and it was perhaps this experience of strange lands that led him to react against prevailing British painting and produce a new and highly individual style. Hodges reached India in 1780 and stayed there for almost 4 years. He arrived in Madras in February 1780, but due to the outbreak of the Second Mysore War, he was moved to Calcutta, where he gained patronage of Warren Hastings, the then Governor General of India. His later travels resulted in many images, which he regularly exhibited at the Royal Academy. He was elected to be an associate in 1786 and became a Academician in 1787. Right. So talking about this is just to give you a brief introduction about William Hodges, and these are his views on Banaras, which are being catalogued in his book Travels in India. So talking about his artistic style, William aimed to reproduce genuine reproduction of truth, candor, and justice, and he's basically known for his picturesque landscapes and seascapes. Hodges was increasingly sensitive to the atmospheric conditions and the effects of the effects of light, and he tried to incorporate a realistic and naturalistic approach to denote the climate and time. So in his representations, you'll find a European sense of aesthetics, right, which is mainly picturesque in nature, but not strictly topographical one, but also includes architectural establishments, as you can see here. I'll I'll just discuss about this painting. Sorry, this aquatine. So this is the Alarmgate Mosque, which was built on the foundations of the Vishnu temple or the Bindu Mahadev temple by Aurangzeb. So uh, he added three domes and two minarets, as shown here, and these were of 163 feet height, respectively. Right. So this thing is this establishment, the The Alarmgate Mosque is, situated on the Panchaganga Ghat, as I mentioned, and where there's a confluence of five rivers. mainly Yamuna, Saraswati, Dudhpa, Kirna, and Ganga. And talking about the history of the ghat was made with stone steps in 1580 by Raghunath Tandon. In 1735, Bajirao Peshwa I, together with Sadashiva Naik, rebuilt and repaired it. And again in 1775, renovations and repairings were done by Shripati Rao Peshwa and Pant Pratinidhi of Andhra. So the ghats of Varanasi, were constantly rebuilt under various patronages. So, this is just to give you sort of a hindsight on the ghats. And now I'll be discussing about the artistic and the aesthetic details. So, as you can see, this is a composition where the skyline crosses the diagonals of the frame by both reinforcing and blurring them, catering to a desire of an irregular outline that was required by the artist's aesthetic. Hodges has managed to create a luminosity over the banks of the river, with sunlight reflecting from the facade of the building in the center. Ganga River is shown with multiple light and dark ripples, denoting the movement of the clouds. And as you can see, this entire composition sort of generates a beautiful, serene, scenic setting, which is characteristic of the European painters. They majorly focused on the landscape and the topographical setting. But here, what you'll see, especially in these artists, that they included the architectural establishments because the primary aim was to catalog the scenic views of India to show it to their, respective country, to their empire then. And this is just to give you a brief sort of a since the minarets are now not there, they are damaged and have been put down by the government because they got damaged during the floods. So these are not here, and this is just an old photograph, just to sort of provide uh, sort of a image to where you can relate between the two. Moving on, this is an aquatint engraving which shows the Jalashai Ghat. And as the name indicates, Jalashai means putting dead into the water, which is a part of a ritual, before you burn, like after you burn the fire. And it is believed that in the Jalashai Ghat, Lord Shiva still resides. And if you are buried here, you will directly attain moksha. And talking about the artistic and the aesthetic analysis of the composition, it is a horizontal composition with river Ganga meandering in a curve along the Lalita Ghat, the Jalashine Burning Ghat, and the Manikarnika Ghat. You can also see the two minarets of the Alarmgate Mosque towards the horizon. And like I mentioned, the gradation and the tonal variations. So aquatints were, sort of they gave sort of a watercolor effect in printmaking process, and that's why it was pretty much used by most of the artists then to provide a tonal variation in their compositions. And it's sort of the composition is the balance of light and shade. It's a product of the romantic movement which the artists were highly influenced by. This is just to provide you a setting and to relate with the composition. Next, here is the mosque at Chunargarh. So the fort of Chunargarh stands to the south of Ganga and Mirzapur, up to 20 miles from Benares. It was then part of a Benares princely state, standing on the rock of Indian range at an altitude of 280 feet. Ramnagar was named the capital of the former princely state of Benares by Raja Balwant Singh in 1750. This is right. So this is what has been reproduced as a composition here. So this is a horizontal composition with the gateway of the mosque providing it with the verticality, and the entire composition gives a three-dimensional effect, which comes into being with the diagonal angle of the wall towards the left and the outward bent tree. This thing, it sort of, the angularity, it sort of gives a three-dimensional effect to the composition. And talking about the structure, it's a square structure. You can see the Ivan here and the Chhajas here, and the people sitting. This was it's a calm and serene and scenic setting, which was the main aim of the English painters, which they provided as a representation of the 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 view of the Banaras, and to sort of catalog and you know what am I saying? To catalog the beautiful setting and the scenic setting of Varanasi. Next, this is a so Sati has been documented by a lot of English painters, namely James Atkinson and Tilly Kettle. It was something which was frowned upon by the English and by people in general. So here you can here this is an important composition because as you can see, as I've written mentioned here, as this time is to close, she observed me attentively and with the color marked me on the forehead. So this is a very sensitive setting which um, William Hodges has composed, and it's important here because he also interacts um, with the protagonist, which is the widowed woman here. He not only stood there, he was a part of the composition as well. He's not shown himself here, but through his writings, we can see that he also interacted with the woman here, and he has tried to represent the innate emotions of sorrow, sorrow and fear, and the facial expressions of all those pandits which are accompanying her, and the funeral pile which is here, and the dead body of her husband. And if you can see the emotions which she has tried to portray very eloquently here, and the muscularity of the human body, and it's very accurate, which is pretty interesting given the time period and the mode of uh, composition here. So the body is ready to be taken up to the funeral pyre, and there's this the priests are accompanying her and consoling her the same. So this was that of William Hodges. Next, I'll be progressing to Thomas and William Daniel.
Before progressing, Chandrima, sorry to interrupt, but 20 minutes are up, so
Right,
would
right,
like
right.
to
So I'll just wrap it up in a I just hope I'm able to wrap this up. So I'll just give you a brief introduction about Thomas and William Daniel. So Thomas was William's uncle, right? So they were related because he was the nephew of him, and they traveled across India, and they tried to capture the topographical and the architectural establishments. And okay, so this is that the composition of the Aurangzeb's mosque, the Alarmgate Mosque. And here you can also see the emphasis given on the light and shade and shadows, and the ripples on the river Ganga. You can see the sunlight falling on the ripples and giving it a very scenic setting. And this is just to give you an image to relate with. And this is the Ramnagar Fort. Like I mentioned, the Ramnagar Fort built by. I'm not giving you a. Hang on. Wait, how much time did I take? Wait, sorry. I think I should wrap it up, right? I think I should wrap it up because this is just the same topographical settings that I had shared earlier. Hi, sorry if I took a lot of time. I went into.
no, it's wrapped perfectly fine. 20 minutes are just up.
Thank you, thank you. Are there any questions?
Sorry, can you pardon?
Are there any questions?
Yeah, are there any questions for the audience, right?
Yeah, you can you can speak.
Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So this may be a little general question, which you would that your presentation doesn't talk about, and I would
Mhm.
understand if you would will not. But I'm interested into what the the how did Romanticism actually affected India in the context? Because if we see when Romanticism actually comes originates in Europe and when it comes to India, it becomes distorted to some extent that we call it an Orientalism or the Oriental gaze, which so like if you could talk a little bit on how Hodges and Daniel developed that Oriental gaze of Banaras, which was to some extent different from what we understand the Indian space as. Because this
Right.
was the
So,
period of okay, yes, sorry, continue.
yeah, yeah. Continue, continue.
Okay, so like this, like as we know, this was the period of the development of the uh, British hegemony and the uh, mm, British structure of power and control. So, if you could speak in terms of these lines, thank you.
Right. So, with, like you said, Orientalism was something which was associated with the West. And the effect of Orientalism on the Indian art comes in with the interaction of the Indian artists. Like, it starts with the traveler, with the British traveling artists. Namely, like in this presentation, I tried to incorporate William Hodges and Thomas and William Daniels. What their representation can is called Orientalism, right? And the effect of Romanticism comes here because if you had seen in all those compositions, the scenic beauty that I was talking, the scenic serenity of the compositions, right? It was not like the giving the light and shade of the setting and the composition here, and the tonal effect which was provided. That are some of the basic characteristics of both Orientalism and the Romanticism. So what Romanticism did was it was more to talk about you know um the fantasy world, right? The thing which the ideal world, the ideal representation of a setting. So it didn't, even if you look at the compositions here, it didn't give out the harsh realities of there, such as poverty and sort, the roads. Maybe just to talk in general terms, but it provided sort of a setting which was, in capturing and how do I say it? In capturing and what's the right word for it? I'll say scenic because that is something which even I have been reading. So serene, calmness, sort of that. So your question is how does Orientalism effect has its effect on Indian art, right?
Like the like Orientalism leads to the Oriental gaze, as we have that how the British observed Indian structures, how the British observed Indian space, uh, and this was also like the period of uh, the uh, translation of various Indian texts. This was the time of the Royal Bengal, the Royal Asiatic Society, and there was this gaze which permeated, and the gaze was materialized through paintings, which we just saw in Hodges. And uh, I just wanted to know that, like, I think you have answered it more or less with what you could, like how the aesthetic was shown without the actual harsh reality. And this was the time of Romanticism, which is the fantasy world. So I think I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank
Okay,
you.
so with that, we can move on, right?
Thank you,
Yes,
Chandrima.
Anchit, I had a
Tha-
question.
Thank you so much, Chandrama. That was really interesting information. Moving on, pop culture is quite a trend, right? From music to dance to clothes, pop culture has its own niche. But have you ever thought about their place in the past? To know more about it, we have with us Shagnick Bhattacharya from BA History Honours third year, a close friend of mine and, of course, classmate. And today he will be enlightening us about the history of pop culture in revolutionary France. Shagnick, please.
Okay, hello everyone. I will be talking on a brief history of popular culture in revolutionary France today. There are only a few events in history that have been fueled and sustained by, as well as transformed, to the extent that of popular culture that was observed during the course of the French Revolution. Between 1789 and 99, there were significant and rapid changes in all aspects of French popular culture. These changes were not only reflected what was happening, but were also reflecting, uh, like they were also shaping the outcome of what was to happen and providing a way for the people to know of contemporary events. For an average person living in revolutionary France, for instance, the act of wearing a Phrygian cap and sans-culottes, which was a symbol of freedom from slavery and solidarity between the revolutionaries, meant their support for the revolution and possibly indicated their belief that all the chaos and bloodshed caused by the revolution was justified. So I'll begin my uh, talk by talking about the historiography that emerged. uh, uh, like the historiography of the French Revolution is as old as the event itself, but a cultural approach towards the study of this French Revolution emerged in the 1980s due to two factors. Intellectually, it was the time when the subdiscipline of the new cultural history took shape with theoretical advances in anthropology, sociology, literary criticism, and feminist theory, affecting how history was to be perceived. Politically, the bicentennial of the French Revolution was arriving late in the decade, garnering interest from politicians and academics alike on the history and perception of the revolution. Over time, this subdiscipline split into two different traditions, one focusing on the study of culture as distinct from politics, economy, and society of the period, while the other one focused more on mentality and political, economic, and social interpretations of cultural developments. However, three key points of this new cultural history tradition were realized in the late 1980s, which were common to all the approaches within this subdiscipline. First among them being that social and political revolutions are caused by prior cultural shifts. Secondly, revolutions take place within and through changes in political culture. And thirdly, revolutions like that of 1789 have long term cultural consequences. This tradition has had many famous historians from belonging to it, like Lynn Hunt, like Roger Cartier, and this tradition also had its fair share of critics, like Susan Dasan and Rebecca Spang. And there were also critics within the tradition, like Roger Cartier, who like was a proponent and a critic of this tradition. Uh, uh, Now, in the 21st century, there have been further advances in the historiography of this particular tradition of history, with an intensified focus on popular experience in an anthropological sense. However, compared to the boom in historical studies in French Revolution in the 1980s, this topic doesn't create much buzz now because, like, France is no longer a big part of global popular imagination as it once was, and due to its declining culture and political position in the present world. I would now jump to the real topic of my presentation. I will be analyzing different portions of popular culture, like visual culture, literary culture, cuisine, clothing, songs and music, and religious experiences. So I'll begin with visual culture, in which I would be starting with paintings. So official propaganda on a mass scale had its origin in the French Revolution, as French public opinion was constantly manipulated by the leaders of the revolution in order to mobilize support for it. This was in part achieved by using symbols to represent revolutionary ideas in paintings. For instance, the depiction of cockades symbolized support for the revolution, broken shackles and Phrygian caps represented liberty, and the revolutionary tricolors of red, white, and blue stood for national unity. In this, like in all the paintings that we see, there was a tendency which first emerged as a part of the Enlightenment tradition of using female imagery to symbolize the ideals of the French Revolution, like democracy, equality, and liberty. This might be taken to imply a better position of women in the new society of revolutionary France, but it can easily also be observed that a female figure in such paintings were always depicted as either beautiful or strong, hardly ever possessing both the qualities. It was also pointed out by a scholar named Pradhom that the reason for the use of female imagery was the appeal of their sexuality. Even though the images were not overtly erotic, they represented symbolically the popular idea that women should give themselves sexually to the heroes of the revolution. Anti-revolutionaries and disillusioned revolutionaries too utilized what little power they considered women to possess in order to advance their own cause, which was possible since women in this period had limited connotations in art and were largely excluded from public affairs. Now, among all the painters from this period, Jacques Louis David was the most prominent Paris born artist, known for his support of the revolution and renowned for using classical stories and imagery as a vehicle for enlightenment political values. He, in fact, dominated the artistic culture of the revolution with an immense role in propaganda of revolutionary ideals through his paintings. And many of us would be aware with his famous paintings like Napoleon crossing the Alps or the tennis court oath and the death of Marat. And these paintings were like somehow or the other being shaped by the revolution and were in turn also shaping public opinion for the revolution. Now, coming to the next aspect of visual culture, we have theater. Theater was used and conceived as a tool for nation building that could unite the masses. Significantly from the period under consideration, the portrayal of ancient republicanism through enactment of dramas like Voltaire's Brutus, one of the three tragedies that were performed like around 3 times a week in all the theaters, as decreed by the National Convention in 1793. So this plays like this offered the French Revolution a sense of founding and acceptance by the people. The revolutionary governments deemed theatre to be important enough such that a lot of measures were undertaken to expand the reach of theatre as much as possible. These were measures like municipalities across France being given huge subsidies to build new theaters, free performances were being given during festivals, informal performances were being held in streets, private residences, and schools to reach out to more audiences. And it was a duty of officials in towns to arrange for theatrical performances if there were not enough being held already. Theater was overall a key medium of making people from all backgrounds realize their place in the French society and to understand what was expected from them by the state. This also meant that the government needed to control the theaters in order to ensure that only those plays were performed that the government wanted the people to see and not the ones that were in opposition to the government. And this is why there was also a system of censorship in place. But even though theater was a heavily controlled tool for national propaganda at the hands of the government, it was even then an effective tool of expression for dissent against the government in subtle ways. In all theatrical performances, ambiguity was omnipresent due to the performative nature of theater, allowing opportunities for ridicule and rejection of ideas that seem to be unacceptable by the actors and their audiences. Once on stage, It was, ultimately the actors who were in control of the play. They could change their dialogues at the last moment by adding lines which were not approved by the censors. They could deliberately forget some of their lines, or they could deliver their dialogues in an ironic or sarcastic manner so as to completely change the meaning of their performance. Furthermore, bodies of actors and their costumes could propagate more information than their performance itself. For instance, an actor playing a historical character during donning a cockade representing the French Revolution to convey that historical characters assumed support for revolutionary ideals is being shown. Operas, as a subset of theater, were also changing in revolutionary France, most notably through musical innovations and changes in style made particularly by composers of opera comique, which was a new genre of opera that contained spoken dialogue instead of recitative ones and arias. In general, opera from this time saw a common theme of using classical settings and heroes from the Crusades and other periods of great turmoil and violence in order to use them as metaphors and draw correlations with revolutionary France. I won't be going into much detail here. I'll be jumping to the next part of visual culture, which is clothing. Now, the French Revolution is often considered to mark the birth of modern fashion by some scholars. The history of clothing before the revolution is largely confined to the elite fashion culture of a small group of well off people in the society. The tastes in elite fashion have always been driven by luxury, and French high fashion was known for its fanciful and formal style. In popular culture, the representation of this elite fashion has always met with fascinated audiences. Depending upon a person's perspective, the clothes that aristocrats and other rich people wore at the time can seem as a symbol of either oppression or grandeur, or both. The extravagant costumes of the aristocracy and the rich members of bourgeoisie had almost disappeared by 1791. Women discontinued wearing hoop skirts and large headdresses, while men abandoned the use of powdered wigs. There were some exceptions, though, Maximilian Robespierre being one of the notable ones because he's always seen with wearing a wig in all his public appearances. Overall, simple and restrained dress like muslin frocks, neatly cut suits and tunics, modest wigs, and hairstyles became a part of the popular fashion of the time. In order to express their loyalty to the revolution, people used to use the tricolor combination of red, white, and blue in their dresses, such as in cockades, ribbons, or trimmings on a coat or a tunic. Around 1791, we see the emergence of a distinct group of common people from the lower classes emerging in opposition to the aristocrats, serving as a radical mass of henchmen for the revolution and carrying it forward, making up the bulk of the revolutionary army. These people came to be known as sans-culottes, literally meaning those without breeches, as they used to wear simple pantaloons instead of silk knee breeches that were fashionable at the time among the nobility and the bourgeoisie. These sans-culottes were an important cultural and symbolic product of the revolution, as they maintained and took control of the changes made by the revolution, represented revolutionary ideals. To show their support for the revolution, some ordinary Parisians even used to replicate the trousers, tunics, and simple headgear of sans-culottes, and many of the sans-culottes even used to dress up in a way to mock and satirize victims of the terror. uh, Terror in the sense, the reign of terror under Maximilian Robespierre, like shaving their heads or wearing a red ribbon around their throats. Perhaps the best way to observe how revolutionary changes were with respect to dress is to see the like is to see two paintings of Louis the 16th that were drawn before and after the revolution. In the one before the revolution, he's wearing like a very extravagant kind of clothing, which would leave a very good impression on the onlooker. While after the revolution, he's seen in a painting wearing much simpler clothes along with a Phrygian cap, a popular symbol of the revolution, and like drinking a toast to the health of sans-culottes. Many historians of the French Revolution have observed fashion for its reflective properties, as it provides a reflection of the broader cultural shifts that occurred. However, B.R. Goodman's work has shown how fashion in itself was an active force in bringing out cultural change in revolutionary France, apart from just reflecting the broader changes in the society. uh, because upon closer inspection of transformations like the shift from wide and heavy clothing prior to the revolution to elongated and lightweight clothing after it, and the times at which such transformations occur, we see that these occur at like before their respective cultural transformations. It is actually the revolutionary fashion that is preceding the events of the revolution that will eventually establish that particular fashion as the fashion associated with the revolution once the events start taking place, as they keep unfolding. The revolutionary fashion was also notable for introducing the rejection of the idea of social distinction based on dress, rather shifting to social distinction based on self-worth and consumer capabilities. Simultaneously, fashions of the revolution cultivated a modern sense of individuality through the evocation of nature, pleasure, and art. That's all I had to say for visual culture. As for the literary culture, we see that French Revolution doesn't actually change much in terms of the books, novels, and the poetry that is coming along at the period, except we only get to see that in the field of poetry we see the first generation of the romantic poets. But other than that, not much of the events of the French Revolution I think are being discussed in that. But a French Revolution gives rise to different kinds of literature, namely public speeches, pamphlets, and libels. So public speeches are uh, like the thing about these things were that they were cheap to produce and they were easy to propagate, easy to understand, and these had a much broader audience and political potential than any other form of literature. So, like in terms of speeches, the use of revolutionary rhetoric created a new political language, and a standard of leadership was established revolving around oratory and one's ability to navigate through dynamic and chaotic circumstances. The art of influencing people with inflammatory oratory presented in loud voices came into prominence with increasing intensity of political debate in Paris during the revolution, which were happening inside places like coffee houses, on the streets, in clubs, in the national assemblies, or before tribunals. Speaking in the name of reason, virtue, and liberty, and using the Roman Republic or the city states of Greece as a frame of reference, revolutionary leaders such as John Paul Marat and Maximilian Robespierre, they infused the intellectual preoccupations of the Enlightenment with a sense of drama and passion. An enthusiastic and integrated political community was being created as the dynamic atmosphere of public speeches enhanced people's interest in politics. The openness of public speeches also invited many new non traditional manners of political participation. A speech was filled with interruption, noise, silence, applause, physical presence, and withdrawal of the audience. And all these gestures had their own meaning to convey to the speaker and like made this was a very popular kind of thing in revolutionary France. As for the pamphlet literature, it was made possible by the development of typographic printing in 15th, 16th centuries. It became a very powerful political weapon with the arrival of French Revolution, and although pamphlets had began to be used even before the revolution began, their objectives were quite simple: to educate the common people about revolutionary ideas and to provide the audience with some knowledge on related topics. The pamphlets essentially became primary source of information and knowledge regarding the revolution for the common people. Because of their wide readership, the contents of the pamphlets played a weighty role in directing public opinion. And the only limitation of pamphlets was that it was unable to directly reach out to those who could not read. As for libels, another kind of the literature that arose at the time, they were rudimentary, defamatory, and frivolous forms of literature, mostly of a pornographic nature, that degraded and attacked the policies and behavior of public figures. They were available in many different forms of literature, as flyers, as pamphlets, dramatic scripts, collections of cartoons, or even serious sounding essays in the guise of journalism. In revolutionary France, the biggest victim of such literature was Queen Marie Antoinette, on whom the vast majority of libels were made after early 1789 till she was executed in 1793. Uh, while
20 minutes
libels
is
did
up,
not,
Shagnick, and we wrap up
I
quickly.
am not done yet. Yeah. While libels did not advocate revolution or contain much
Shagnik,
political criticism of,
sorry, we'll have to stick to the time. We'll have to wrap it up. Huh.
okay, uh, I have much more to say.
Oh, any,
Uh,
you can
can
continue.
I complete this, and can I then complete the cuisine part? Then
Sorry, Shagnick, but can you please conclude, please?
I can't conclude here. Like,
You can try a bit harder, Shagnick, to conclude it fast because we have more contestants to go.
okay, wait. Like, while liberals did not advocate revolution or contain much political criticism of the old regime, their aim being simply to earn money from ransom, from blackmailing prominent public figures and the sale of libels, they undoubtedly eroded public respect and affection for the monarchy. They reflected as well as reinforced the popular sentiments of disaffection and lack of faith in monarchy. The lack of information for the common people about the royal family in itself ensured the popularity of libels. Uh, I was supposed to speak on religion and social interactions. Basically, it was that Catholic Christianity was initially completely rejected and cults were being created, like the cult of reason that was created by Robespierre. And two cults were created, after which there was a brief period of conflict between people about what faith to follow. But then Catholicism was ultimately restored when Napoleon took power. Cuisine, as for cuisine, we see very interesting changes. We see the origin of the first restaurants. We have, like, since after the revolution, the aristocracy was being removed from the picture. A lot of cooks that and servants that were initially employed under the aristocracy were being free to open up businesses in the open market. So we see the emergence of restaurants, a new French cuisine, and there were many more culinary developments that were available to the common people. As for music too, uh, music and songs, we see many different things. As for music, it can be said that it was more of an evolution rather than a revolution, as in it went through different stages of development. It became more refined during the time, but there wasn't some kind of radical change in the nature of the music being produced. uh, except that music was an important part of all revolutionary festivals and gatherings. And even during the storming of Bastille, there was a group of musicians who were hired by Bernard Sarret, who would later go on to become the director of Paris Conservatory in 1796, to play music while
With that,
the
Shagnick,
Bastille
I'm
was
really
being
sorry,
stormed.
but we have to
Just
stop you
wait,
right now, please.
just wait. Uh, as for songs, it can be like divided into different phases, but I'm not going into details. Uh, that's it. Okay. Okay, I can wrap it up here. The important thing to see is that culture, popular culture, was not only being influenced by the events of the revolution, but it was also influencing the revolution as events were unfolding. That's the basic point of what I had to convey. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, Shagnick. That was quite interesting. Next up, we have Anchit Jain. He is an alumni of History Department DCAC batch of 2017 and has done his post graduation from department with specialization in ancient Indian history. Currently, he is doing MPhil on the early medieval history on site in Rajasthan called Husain, if I'm pronouncing it right, under supervision of art historian Professor Parul Pandyadhar. His current research engagements pertain to the early medieval history of the Thar Desert, animal-human interaction, art history, and temple architecture, early medieval history of Shwetambar Jain monasticism, and the cultural and scholastic tradition of Swami Narayan Sampradaya. Moreover, he has recently published an article in Hampana Swastika volume that deals with the process of revival of the naked Digambar Jain monks in the 19th and 20th century and formation of modern Digambar Jainism. Without further ado, Anchit, please.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, it's perfectly fine. We can see it.
Yeah, it is changing now.
It's changing. It's changing.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Niru ma'am, and for DCSC for inviting me. So, my topic is Thar as a terra incognito, constructing its early medieval economic and cultural dynamics. So, if I ask you to think about Thar Desert or the region of Jaisalmer, Bikaner, Badmer, you might probably think of such arid land which has been shown in the background. And this is how the region of Thar has been traditionally perceived. Um, some decades back, when Hermann Goetz wrote about Thar, he writes, and I quote, "This is the Thar Desert for millennia, a no man's country, jungle desh, crossed only by occasional caravans or half-wild nomads. However, with around 5-6 decades, the historiography of Thar has changed a lot. And to give a brief overview of that, I quote a small statement by Tanuja Kotial about the same tract of Thar. She writes, and I quote, while the agricultural productivity of Ganga Jamuna basin in North India fostered the agrocentric political structures in the arid Thar, land was largely significant as passage for trade and pastures. So, separated by a gap of around 6 decades, these two subjective remarks on Thar betray a major shift in the academic outlook towards Thar. Hermann Goetz has repeated an old rustic narrative which long persisted in the colonial writings on Thar as a land of melancholy, waste, and wilderness. Such anathema to desert has an even older history, as one sees in the writings of Yuan Sang and Abul Fazl. Recently, scholars like Dr. Manisha Chaudhary have contested these popular notions of deserts being largely inhospitable and wasteland. And these revisionist scholars have showed that such a narrative emerges largely from an outsider perspective who fail to see this desert from the perspectives of human beings living there. So these quite few revisionist works use the medieval and late medieval state chronicles to freshly represent the region of Thar as an active and vibrant economic region. However, what about the history of Thar during the period earlier than the establishment of medieval states like that of Rathod and Bhatis. What about the early medieval history of Thar, its socio-economic and cultural dynamics? The revisionist historiography on early medieval state formation has emphasized on agrarian proliferation coupled with successful irrigation practices, which provided a major push in the establishment of settlements, peasantization of tribes, and proliferation of ruling lineages. And here I repeat the classical argument of Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay. The region of Thar, however, remained as a terra incognita in these discourses surrounding the early medieval dynamics of Rajasthan, largely due to absence of quote-unquote significant agrarian potentials, which constitutes to our understanding of a nuclear zone of cultural and economic proliferation. It is this narrative which is being cautioned in this paper through a correlation with the regional environmental history. So some of the central issues which I'll be highlighting are the economic exchange, early medieval economic exchange between the regions of Marwar, Sindh and Jaisalmer, the trading networks and trade routes of Thar, the role of animals and pastoralism in this economic nexus, and the cultural dynamics of early medieval Thar. So before proceeding to those central issues, I would like to just give a brief overview of the terrain. So Aravali divides the region of Rajasthan in broadly two regions. This has been described on its eyes. Can you see my cursor? Okay, I hope you might be able to see. So this is the Aravali.
Yes, yes, it's
Huh.
visible.
Region on the right is generally treated as wet Thar, this whole, and while this whole region is treated as dry Thar. So, but generally when we speak of Thar, we speak of the dry Thar, and when I'll be using Thar in my paper, I'll be also talking of the dry Thar. But this whole region is also not uniform. So while these districts of Jaisalmer, Barmer have huge sand tracts, but as recently people have stated that this Jaisalmer could not be properly stated as a desert, but as an extremely dry steppe. And even within this region, the ecology is not uniform, and there are some agrarian tracts. As we proceed more towards eastward in this core of Marwar, there are more fertile tracts, and the a greater fertility, the region of fertility is located towards this eastern region. So whatever has largely constituted the historiography of early medieval Rajasthan, thanks to works of Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay and Nandini Sinha Kapoor, they have been limited to this eastern or the western, so this eastern and southeastern Rajasthan. This region of western Rajasthan, southwestern Rajasthan, has been rarely discussed upon. So I'll be focusing largely on on this region. Uh, the early medieval sources belonging to Western Rajasthan are fairly limited, with a large corpus of local epigraphs being unpublished. So the epigraphs of this Jaisalmer regions are largely unpublished and not in public. However, I'll try to incorporate most of the sources available of Jaisalmer, but a major portion of the reconstruction of the early medieval history of Dayathar is based on the local visual remains, epigraphic records of this Marwar region, as well as the external literary sources. So, my research for the economy of early medieval Thar began as a result of my deep curiosity to find the reasons for the emergence of the site on which I'm working for my MPhil, Ossia. So, and this is located near Jodhpur. So, this was a major religious and artistic center which yielded more than a dozen and half temples of early medieval period, 8th to 12th centuries. But unlike the more fertile regions of southeastern Rajasthan, where agrarian expansion resulted in early medieval state formation, the potential of agrarian expansion in this region was historically limited. So how could then such a major artistic and religious center could emerge in arid land, and how the temple construction and renovation activities were economically sustained for around 5 centuries? So when I studied the local epigraphs and the visual data, one could I completely glean was that the site had significant urban character with the presence of merchants, courtesans, aristocratic classes and a large presence of traders of Dharkat caste and a kind of a cluster of hatta and markets in those networks. And also, a very important evidence was the large presence of Arab silver hoards of 8th century. So, if the Arab coins were present in this region, um, then definitely there might have been certain trading network between Osia and the region of Sindh. So this resulted in a kind of a exploration of the trading networks and the trade routes which operated between the region of Sindh. I hope my cursor is visible, between the region of Sindh, Multan, Jaisalmer, and this region of Osia, and how this was connected to the other regions of Rajasthan and central India as well as Gujarat. So, before deliberating upon the trade routes, it is pertinent to understand to what extent was the region of Sindh was culturally and economically integrated with Marwar and Rajasthan. This is I consider this as important because whatever limited studies that have been done on the trade relations between Sindh and this part of Rajasthan has been largely done for late medieval period. And what is that for the early medieval period? And also in terms of local ecology, the western Rajasthan, including the region of Marwar, shares more in common with the region of Sindh than with the agrarian eastern Rajasthan. So this involved the studies. This involves the study of exchange of economic, religious, and cultural ties between two regions until the colonial intervention, till the modern colonial intervention and partition. The two regions, of Western Rajasthan and Sindh, were known for the pastoral and nomadic movements. We have medieval records for the two-way exchange of grains between between the two regions, of the migrations caused by famine, drought, distress, or further trade. And even though these records are not directly available for early medieval period, there are no reasons to doubt that this would not have happened for the early medieval period. However, at least we do have direct evidence for the movement of mendicants, particularly the Jain monks across this region towards Sindh, as well as for the exchange of artistic ideas, which I'll be discussing in the later phase of my presentation, and definitely for the commercial networks and for the trade. So. Uh, and even when I mentioned about the discovery of Arab silver hoards in the region of Ostia, but they were also available in the region of Badmer, in Medta, in Mandor, and and we have epigraphic records for supporting this trading network with Sindh for the early medieval period. For example, one 10th century epigraphic records also mention of the visit of Arab merchants to the markets of Guhil Center, Ahad near Jodhpur. Therefore, trade routes passed across Thar was central to the broader economic configuration of Western Rajasthan. This whole thing received very less academic attention, except few brief mentions. Professor V.K. Jain mentioned two routes across the region of Thar. One passed from Patan, if you can follow my cursor. One passed from Patan and then Pali, and then, oh sorry, from Patan, and from here Pali, and then from here it reaches Badmer, Kirdu, and directly towards Sindh. The another route he mentioned was from this Pali, Badmer, Jaisalmer, and Sindh. Now, I have found certain problems in his arguments. I'll not go in the details, but there are two things which I want to mention. First, these routes which he mentioned could not be earlier than the 10th century. So, what about the period from 8th to 10th century? And also, there was one more route which I constructed during the course of my research. It was this route, this Jaisalmer, Ocean, Mandor, and this Medta route. So this was one route which I reconstructed during the course of my research. Now, why is this issue of trade routes important? This is important because of the wide economic proliferations, there was a dynamic of of change of the economic configuration, where new routes were emerging, certain new link routes were emerging, as well as some routes were becoming more important than another. For example, this route across ocean, this Mandor follow ocean follow the Jaisalmer, this route was definitely important from 7th 8th century. By around 10th 11th century, this the route across Badmer became more important, and certain new routes emerged. So definitely there were kind of a prolific economic activities that were going on. And apart from the fact that the local polities, for example, the Bhati chieftains of Jaisalmer, Lodrava region, the local family of Pratihas at Mandor, they were also involved. They were also involved in the economic activities of the period. So while the trade played an important role in the growth of urban centers, the long-term sustenance required some other backings. The strategic location on a route in itself does not result in the emergence of urban centers, but requires various degrees of participation by residents into the broader economic configuration. However, in the case of Thar, its earlier progress was linked to its location in the economic networks of Western India, but the scope of significant agrarian expansion to support this was limited for maneuvering the further growth. Despite the traditional adoptive agrarian practices conducive to the local ecology and the attempts by the local power authorities to encourage agriculture, in that case, I argue that growth was largely backed by the role played by domesticated animals, which were abundantly available here and were of best qualities. So the animals of Western Rajasthan were abundantly available and were of best qualities. They were exported, and I also highlight the role of the socioeconomic groups whose lives were directly entangled to these animals, the pastoralists and the pastoral nomads. The local merchants and the quote unquote states were deeply interested in the maximum utilization of the local mobile sources like the animals, and also the immobile local sources like salt, the importance of which to the local power authorities is well recorded for even for the medieval period. So the contemporary Jain texts like the Kathakosh Prakranam and Upamiti Bhav Prapanch Katha of 19th century, they encourage merchants to invest in animals like camels, mules, bullocks for caravan trade. And during course of my research, I could find many epigraphic records which highlight the importance of animal products like ghee, and we have epigraphic records for the cattle rates in this region, on transit duties on caravans. I could not find early medieval records on taxes imposed on the sale of animals, but the medieval records for this tax on animal sales are quite abundant, and there is no reason to doubt that this would not have happened during the earlier period also. The importance of camel in the local economy resulted in emergence of certain temple reliefs in the regions like Kiradu in Badmer and Mandor near Jodhpur. So this is I want to show this one relief. This is from a 9th 10th century temple from Mandor, which is located on this trade route network. If you see this, there are two camels shown here, and camels taking part in certain military procession as also in the caravans. So this is interesting. I consider this interesting because depiction of animals on temple walls, unless if they are parts of some narrative scenes, are strictly structured by faithful repetition of certain classical motifs. Like you would say, elephants bane hai, lions bane hai, vyal bane hai. But the economic success of Thar was closely related to a strong collaboration between state, trade merchants, pastoral groups, and animals. And this was how this became visually represented in one of the temple. Now, my last section will deal with the cultural dynamics of early medieval Thar. My main argument is that in the arid regions of Thar, the pastoralists and nomads are often the first who locate the pathways in the local terrains for the transhumans. Trade networks often develop on these routes if conducive for the transportation, and along the trade routes flow the artistic and cultural ideas. Um, So a careful study of the temples of the region of Thar suggests an inter-regional and intra-regional exchange of artistic and religious ideas. Let me show the map once more. When I say about intra-regional and inter-regional, so if we treat this whole region as Thar, this Jaisalmer Lodrava region is one region of Thar. This Bardmer region, which incorporates side of Kirdu and Chotan, which actually emerged after 10th, 11th century. This is another region. Now you can treat this as another region of Thar, this Mandor Ocean region. So within the regions of Thar, as well as outside, like within the agrarian regions of southeastern Rajasthan, with Gujarat, with central India, and also with Sindh and Multan. So if we do a careful study of the temples of Thar, there we can clearly glean an inter-regional and intra-regional exchange of artistic and religious ideas. uh, and there are some works which I could locate on the temples, which are but on temples, but these are largely works dealing with individual sites. But I could hardly encounter any work which comprehensively looks at the artistic exchange networks of Thar. So, what could have been reason for this neglect of the region of the temples of Thar on by the art historians? Uh, I consider this partly as a result from the limited availability of early medieval structural and sculptural remains in most of these subregions, but also partly due to general neglect of non-agrarian belts in the historical discourse. A large number of excavated sculptural remains from the Lodrava region. Let me show map again. This is Lodrava Jaisalmer region. So a large number of excavated and sculptural remains from this region suggests that this was a major religious and artistic center in the 9th 10th century. Temple construction began in the region of Jaisalmer from around late 8th or early 9th century. And this one thing, if you'll notice, these two temples, this one on your left is from Jaisalmer region. The one on your right is from the Medta region. Now this is Medta region. If you'll notice, there are strong parallels in the temples of two regions. That implies that there were exchange of artistic ideas between these two regions of Rajasthan. And if you particularly notice this motif, I have this zoom thing. This is called Kunja Rakshika. And if you trace the development and the exchange of these motifs, this motif became really popular in the Medta region around 7th 8th century, and from 10th 11th century. And we see gradually how this motif moved from this region to this region. And from late 10th century and 11th century, and I mentioned that this route was more popular around 8th century, and from 10th 11th century these new routes began to emerge, and this new economic configurations had impact on the exchange of artistic ideas as well. So for example, from 10th 11th century, we see how the temples of Jaisalmer Lodrava region began to influence the temples of Chotan. From 11th century, we see how the temples of Kirdu had artistic influence on the temples of Jaisalmer Lodrava region and Ocean. So in nutshell, there were exchange of artistic ideas and between these regions, and Michael Mister has also showed the how certain temples of this region in Sindh, for example, the Patan Munara temple, had close artistic affinity with the temples of Marwar. Now I will conclude. While the role of agriculture in the economic and cultural prosperity of early medieval Thar could not be neglected, its role could not be similarly emphasized or overemphasized. The early medieval Thar had its own peculiar and regional historical process where even nomadic tribes were involved in trade, for instance, the Bhattis. Traders were interested in animals. Local powers benefited from various economies, be it trade, animal husbandry, pastoralism, agriculture, agropastoralism, nomadism, etc. so they were benefiting from various economies converging in their region. Dr. Ajay Dandekar has recently problematized the conception of what constitutes a nuclear or perennial region, which is generally considered, which is generally conflated with agrarian centers. So he has pointed that this kind of a bias in writings of historians and archaeologists and anthropologists is because of we have a bias where we considered the sedentary areas, the regions of agriculture, as far more important. These are considered such nuclear or perennial regions in the traditional writings are considered to be the principal river basins that forms the major agricultural areas and that constitutes the core of states. Now, Ajay Dandekar has criticized this point. He argued that in the case of Western Deccan, the center
Sorry, the
periphery.
20
I
minutes
have
are
just
over.
2 minutes, 2 lines more.
Okay, okay.
Huh. The center periphery argument could be modified in favor of pastoralism. In a similar way, I argue that the arid terrains of Thar could be also labeled as a nuclear or a perennial region of an emerging vibrant economy and cultural efflorescence if and only if we skip an agrarian bias towards a more complex interaction of agriculture, agropastoralism, pastoral nomadism, and trade. Besides, if we also consider animals and subaltern economic groups like the nomads and the pastoralists as who are associated with these animals to be a major contributor to the culture, just as the traders and the powerheads. Thank you.
Thank you, Anchit. That was very interesting to hear about.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Next, now to illuminate this evening with her knowledge, we have with us Tejaswi Singh, a student from second year of our history department and a very cheerful junior of mine, who will be doing a brief analysis of the origin of the Kumbh Mela, its historical significance, mythological and religious significance, and differences and commonality between Sangam and Kumbh. Tejasvi, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Riya. I will start presenting immediately because of the time-bound nature of this presentation. Can I confirm if my screen is visible and if
Yeah, it's visible. It's visible.
is it moving?
Yeah, it's more.
All right, just a second. Right. So my paper is about assessing the historicity of Sangam and the Kumbh Mela of Prayagraj, Allahabad, as we used to call it before some years. And Tulsidas says in Tulsidas Ramayana, Ko kahi sake Prayag Prabhav, which means who can describe the essence of Prayagraj. And the reason to present this paper lump sum is that although people know a lot about Sangam, like common people know a lot about Sangam and the Kumbh Mela, there's from the perspective of history, there's not much known to us. We know about legends, but we can't distinguish between legends and history. And that is the motive of this paper, to try and understand legends and history separately and to analyze if the two terms Sangam and Kumbh Mela, as they are used interchangeably, whether or not it is correct. So this is a picture from 2014's Kumbh Mela, and like every time I'm mentioning Kumbh Mela and Sangam, I'm talking about Prayagraj only, considering there are other Kumbh Melas, three other Kumbh Melas. So this is an aerial picture. This is an aerial picture of the same, and it speaks volumes about how much people are spiritual about the Mela and how many people gather to dip in the spiritual water. To add on textually is this number: over 24 crore people visited Kumbh in 2019, which is more than the total tourists in UP between 2014 and 17, as per the UP government website. And whenever we speak of Kumbh, these are some images that come to our mind, that we visualize, because that's how we understand the Kumbh Mela and Sangam. But now we'll come to the historicity and other aspects of it. This is the district map of Prayagraj, if you can see my cursor. This is the place where Ganga and Yamuna meet, and also the mythical Saraswati, which is also called the Gupta Saraswati, because it is religiously it is said it is there, but there's no traces of any other river other than Ganga and Yamuna. In Rig Ved, it is said that those who bath at the place where the two rivers, white and dark, white for Ganga because its water is blue, and dark for Yamuna because its water is green in color, flow together, rise up to the heaven. So from it can be understood the importance this place has, Prayagraj has in Hinduism, because it's mentioned starting from Rigvedas. And it is said that Brahma, who's also called the creator of the universe, chose a land on earth which was Prayagraj, and he performed the Prakrisht Yagya here. And because the earth was thus started from this place, humanity and humans began from this particular place, it is also referred to as the Tirtharaj, or the king of all pilgrim centers. Other than that, we have Padma Puran and Brahma Puran also mentioning Prayagraj. It says, as the sun is amongst the moon and the moon amongst the stars, likewise Prayag is best amongst all places of pilgrimage. And Brahma Puran says that dipping yourself in the same waters during the month of Magh bestows results of millions and millions of Ashwamedh Yagya. And as students of history, we know the importance of Ashwamedh Yagya during the Vedic and later Vedic period. But how do we distinguish legends and history, and where do we come to recognize the historicity of Sangam? So it is believed that Kumbh Mela originated long back, and the story is attested to that of Samudra Manthan, which is also mentioned in the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Puran, and the Vishnu Puran. And the story basically says that it's the churning of the ocean, where the good forces are fighting with the evil forces over a pot of nectar, Amrit. And in a later day extension to this legend, it is said that this pot is spilled at 4 places, which 4 places later become the places of the 4 Kumbh Melas: Haridwar, Ujjain, Nashik, and Prayagraj. And thus the origin of the 4 Kumbh Melas. But again, like it's a legend, so obviously the story is inconsistent. And some state that Vishnu was an avatar, like Vishnu incarnated as Mohini, others stating Dhanvantari or Garun or Indra, it was Indra who spilled the pot. So again, this spilling nectar story, we cannot find it in Vedic era texts dating pre-500 BCE, and neither is this found in later era Puranic texts between 3rd to 10th century. And according to scholars, like scholars in contrast, question these claims of this story, as none of the ancient or medieval era texts mention the Samudra Manthan legend, and importantly, do not link it to a Mela or a festival. So how does Sangam and Kumbh Mela begin to be used interchangeably? According to Giorgio Bonazzoli, he writes in Prayag and its Kumbh Mela. He's a scholar of Sanskrit Puranas, and he says that these are anarchistic explanations and an adaptation of early legends to a later practice by a small circle of adherents who have sought roots of a highly popular pilgrimage and festivals. Like Puranas, now we come to Ramcharitmanas and the Ain Akbari later in the 16th, 17th century. Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas mentions an annual Mela at Prayag, but it does not mention Kumbh as the name of the Mela, and so does Ain Akbari. But the question of it being it it strikes itself away when we read the Tabaqat-e-Akbari, where it is written that various classes of Hindus come from all sides of the country to bath in such numbers that the jungles and plains around it were unable to hold them. And like we see in the pictures of the status quo, that there's no place in Prayag when it comes to Kumbh Mela. There's no place one can put their feet on because there are so many people who come from all across the country. For the Ashoka pillar that is at Allahabad, even the Ashoka pillar, mentions the Magh Mela at Prayag, but the thing is that it's a later edition. Although the pillar is from the 3rd century BCE, this particular inscription was added during Akbar's reign, sometime about 1575. Yes. So now the point is of the existence of a Mela at Sangam. The Mela, how does it come to be known as either Kumbh Mela or Magh Mela? Magh is a month in the Hindu calendar, but why is it only specific to the month of Magh? And how does Kumbh means a pot? So how does the two thing come to be used interchangeably? So although we say that the bathing pilgrimage it's found mentioned in Rig Veda and also in Pali canons of Buddhism, such as the Majjhima Nikaya. And so does the Mahabharata. It mentions twice that bathing in Prayag means atonement for past mistakes and guilt. There are other references to Prayag and riverside festivals in ancient Indian texts, but it is only in the text of Vain Sang during 644 CE that we hear about King Harsha and his capital Allahabad, Prayag, which he states is a sacred Hindu city with hundreds of Dev temples and two Buddhist institutions. And it is here that the first mention of Kumbh Mela takes place and in the present day Prayag. So now we know that there have been melas from a very long time, but how do they accumulate and evolve into Kumbh Mela? Now we'll come to understand that part. And James Mallinson, he's a scholar of Hindu yoga manuscripts and institutions. He says that bathing festivals at Prayag with large gatherings of pilgrimage are attested since at least the middle of the 1st millennium CE. While we have seen that the textual evidence exists for any similar pilgrimage at other major sacred rivers since medieval period. So what is now happening is that is there any question? Okay, never mind. We'll see that. So we see how these 4 different places, the Haridwar, Ujjain, Nashik and Prayag are morphed under the Kumbh Mela brand during the East India Company. It is what I have come to conclude. And it's a colonial intervention where the British colonial era, where it sought to control the war-prone monks and the lucrative tax and trade revenues at these Hindu pilgrimage festivals. So we see that these 4 places and 4 different melas are integrated under the brand of Kumbh for the purpose of revenue. And additionally, the priests have sought the British administration to recognize this particular festival and to protect their religious rights. So we see how old customs are now being channelized into a rigid and strong religious practice, so as to not just produce and collect taxes, but to also strengthen the religious practice, strengthen spirituality and cultural ties between the whole of the country, because now we see people from across the country coming to these 4 different sites, Prayag being the leading one because it's Tirth Raj. So now we distinguish between Kumbh Mela or the Prayag Mela. So Magh Mela is probably the oldest among the current for branding of Kumbh Melas, as it dates from early centuries, because it has been mentioned in several early Puranas. And according to Professor D.P. Dubey, who's a professor at University of Allahabad, he states that none of the ancient Hindu texts calls the Prayag fair a Kumbh Mela. And the first British reference to the Kumbh Mela in Prayag only occurs in 1868 in a report which mentions the need for increased a need for increased pilgrimage and sanction controls at the Kumbh festival to be held in January of 1870. Uh, Kama MacLean states that the early records do not mention Kumbh Mela or the 12-year cycle of the Prayag fair, because I forgot to mention this earlier, but Prayag, the Mahakumbh or the Kumbh Mela, as the UP Chief Minister has now renamed it, it happens at a cycle of 12 years. So, yes. And we see that according to the same person, MacLean says that the Prayagwal Brahmin priests of Prayagraj, of Prayag, they co-opted the Kumbh legend and branded it to the annual Prayag Magh Mela to give it a socio-political circumstance in the 19th century, hence also integrating religion and uniting Hindus under the name, the Kumbh fair. And we end the presentation here. These are the sources that I used for this paper and more. And I am highly obliged that I got an opportunity to present my paper in front of our alumni and senior. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Any question?
Thank you, Anchit.
Yes, it was very fascinating, no doubt about it.
Thank you.
Do we have any question? All right, we don't have much. Okay. Wow, girl, that was so deep.
I have a question.
Okay.
So, Tejaswi, what do you think about the future of this Kumbh Mela? How do you think it will be changing in the future?
So we see how this has always been a center of socio-cultural and more importantly religious center, and people gather. We see how different akhadas, there are six most important akhadas of Hinduism who gather at Prayag, ranging from uh, Nirdohi, if I'm not pronouncing it wrong, that akhada, to that of the Naga sadhus who cross who stay at the Himalayas and who come down to UP and Allahabad just to attend this festival. So we see that the importance has been ever growing, ever evolving, and like the numbers in my first few slides suggest, people from across not just UP and the country but the world come to visit the festival. So from a tourist perspective, it is great for the people of Allahabad. Because it's my city, it's hard for me to call it Prayagraj every time, so I'll rather prefer calling it Allahabad. And yeah, so for them, it's a source of revenue collection income, because the particular month of Magh is really important for daily basis vendors who sell different items, and for traveling, transportation, for the travel industry in general. As for the religion is concerned, we see how there's an in general trend of rising religious sentiments among people. So owing to that circumstance, I think it's only going to grow and get bigger with time.
Okay. Are you satisfied with the answer, Shagnick?
Yeah.
Okay, then. All right. Okay. But that was really beautiful presentation, Tejaswi. I hope our audience is having a nice time digesting these heavy calorie facts. Moving on, last but not the least, we have with us Siraj Ghani, a student from first year from our history department. And today Siraj will be talking us about very interesting topic titled Sonali's Baffling Conundrum. Siraj, please. Correct.
Hello everyone. Am I audible and visible?
Yeah, you are audible and
Yeah.
visible.
Thanks a lot everyone for giving me this opportunity to present myself and my paper in front of the all the academic qualified seniors and teacher. Well, I'll just start my presentation. I'll just share the screen. Is it visible?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So can you just confirm is it moving as well?
Yeah, it's moving too.
So let's start. So the topic which I've chosen for the paper is the Sinoli, a baffling conundrum. Well, Sinoli is a village which is in the western part of the Uttar Pradesh, which is 60 kilometers away from the Delhi. If we talk about, Sinoli was not into history or into the paper of the historians of ASI or any other history department in the world until in 2005, wherein a farmer was randomly just digging up his field and he discovered various uh, pottery which was made of copper as well, wherein he and the entire village was not were fascinated about the discovery which were made about while digging up the field, as it was quite new for them and they were not aware of what kind of pottery or what kind of stuff this was, as they were not literate about the fact that this was really important for an aspect of history. This news spread over the first a fire wherein it was uh, the information went to ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, in 2005, and they secured the site as soon as they could, and they started the discovery or they started to digging up the field in 2005 as well. But the main problem they went through was that the farmer has already digged up the field into a very large extent, wherein they lost a variety uh, of the cultural importance things. They lost it. The farmer were digging up the field in aspect of getting more gold and copper, wherein they could get rich in very minimum time. The villagers of the Sinoli village were really fascinated how this thing can be in their village and how culturally and historically rich their village can. There were several baffling discoveries which were made from the Sinoli, which included off-colored pottery, copper ornaments, gold ornaments, certain kind of jewelries. As we have seen, the burials are the best sources for interpreting history in terms of how culturally rich or how historically enrichment the ancient history or ancient people were. There were several discoveries which was made in the Sinoli, which included antler sword, wherein in Harappa also there was a antler sword found, but the basic thing and the basic crux which was missing in the Harappan civilization or Harappan site were the hilt, wherein it was really a baffling thing for the historians and a conundrum, like how could they have used this antler sword for using it as a weapon or not, as they in the Harappan side the hilt was missing, wherein they were in confusion how they could have hold the sword in their hands, or was it just for a thing to be worshipped, or it was just a thing which could be placed in the burials in respect of any other person and not by using it in the world. Well, this all these things were clear in the aspect of the Sinoli's burial, wherein several antler swords were found in heavy abundance, and the burials really made it clear how culturally rich Sinoli was and how our Indian history can be seen from an entirely new perspective if we talk about in Sinoli's aspect. Sinoli certainly opened certain new window to see Indian history in terms of comparing it to the Harappan civilization as well. The burials have immensely played important role how we have to see Sonali and not inferior the Indian history, and we should be enriching the Indian history how it have opened up a new perspective to see the ancient civilization of the Sinoli in aspect. There were 116 burial found at Sinoli in itself, which continuously make it the largest burial site of the South Asian continent and in the India as well. None of the side of the South Asia has been has been giving evidence of 116 or more than 116 burials. If we talk about 116 burial becomes a really great number, and it was there were certain kind of burials found in the Sonali. there were a certain kind of burial. There were three kind of majorly burials which were found, which was the symbolic burials, wherein there was no skeleton in the burial, only the ornaments or the tools or the objects which was used by the population of the Sinoli was put in. Secondly, there was a primary burial wherein only one skeleton was put in with certain kind of ornaments or any other utilitarian or luxurious items which the person or the civilization was using at that time. Uh, Thirdly, there was significant burial which was found wherein it was considered as the secondary burial, wherein two or more than one skeleton was placed in accordance in same burial, and several ornaments and all the objects which was used by them were also placed. Burials have been found in such abundance that the burials the coffin which in which the burial were placed, the skeleton were placed, the objects were placed, were still intact and were still in the position wherein the historian can and were able to interpret how rituals could have been performed, or how they could have they could have placed the burials in such a quite a nice interesting way. This was only possible because of the copper plating or copper layering which was used on the burial site, on the burials, on the coffin especially. The Sinoli civilization was specially used for using copper in really much abundance, and as we have known, this was part of a later Harappan site, later Harappan civilization, wherein they've used copper in abundance, and they've used copper in that sense that there were mirror also found in terms of copper layering. There were antler sword which was found. It was also layered with copper wire at the end of the hilt as well. If we talk about an aspect of a warrior clan, if we consider, as there were certain evidences of the shield as well also found in the burials of certain people of the civilization, or the Sinoli, wherein there were two distinction between the shield. A shield was made for men and shield for women, wherein the shield for women was much decorated and much smaller in size, which give as this the shield also can be considered as a masterpiece and an empire of outstanding showcase how skillful they were, and how women and men were also participating in the war head to head, and not there was no evidence of women being subjugated to agriculture or domestication, or the part of the household works, as we have seen in the earlier examples of Harappa, wherein women were considered fairly weak and were directed towards home, doing household chores and stuff. But in Sinoli, we've seen how women were enriched and were were actively participating in war. The antler sword was also a great example how the antler sword was also found in the burials of women. This shows how culturally rich the people of the Sinoli were, the kind of pottery they make, the kind of the swords they were making, the kind of finished evidences of oak colored pottery, which was really well finished and which was really enhanced in terms of Sinoli's people. If we talk about in aspect of other civilization, and how Sinoli's people were really and really into the war as well. Uh, the striking and a distinctive, one of the major distinctive and the striking discovery of Sinoli was the chariot. The chariot shattered all the pre-assumption, all the conception that the historians have made that chariot was brought into India by the Aryans. That theory was really shattered, as the chariot which was discovered in this Sinoli was uh, really far more earlier in the time that the Aryans also brought it. Well, the chariot which was found in the Sinoli was not technologically that much advanced if we compare it to the Mahabharata chariot or the Aryan chariot, but still we had a moving chariot in aspect of the Sinoli. The one of the several other thing which was also found was the evidences of the horse skeleton, which we do not found in the Harappan extent. The Sinoli have given evidence of a horse skeleton, which shattered all the myth that the chariot was not run by the horse, but it was in the Sinoli's aspect. Well, there have been a constant debate about how the chariot would have been used. Was it not a masterpiece produced by the Indian civilization, or was it not used by the Indians and it was brought in by the Aryans from the Central Asia, but the chariot which was found was really old than the RNs, which really place it ahead of in its time. Well, the Sinhalese chariot has a hole situated in front of the portion of the chariot box, which wherein only two passengers can be there in the chariot. Wherein in an aspect of the RN civilization, there was a separate, or in a Mahabharata period, there has to be, or there were a separate seat for the driver, for the rider of the chariot, and three people could have been accommodated in that chariot. But instead, the chariot of Sinoli was fairly much inferior in aspect of advancement that the Mahabharata or the Aryan technology was there. But if we talk about how culturally rich the Sinoli civilization was, we can consider that there was a place wherein they used to perform ritual as well, wherein they bury before burying the dead coffin. The certain burials were being certain rituals were being performed at a site, which included how culturally rich and enhanced these Sinhalese people were. Well, there were the excavation of the Sinhali has was stopped in 2018 due to some political or another misconception. But when I visited Sinhali, I found out that the Sinhalese discovery made by the farmer and the people of Sinhali was made the people of Sinhali really happy about that, how culturally rich their village was. As if we talk about Sinhali as a village was not in the history of any history department, or was not in news anytime. But the discovery made in the Sinhali has spurred how the civilization and how the people of Sinhali was enriching, and the how culturally rich was. Well, in later Bronze Age, how the evidences which we have founded out by the discoveries made in this civilization has continuously discovered, and how the Sinhalese civilization was challenging the Harappan civilization, how advanced they were, how well ahead they were. And there is a conception can be drawn from all the discoveries that can this clan be a not a normal civilization, or can it be only a warrior clan wherein they used to only participate in the clan in the wars, and they were especially be in the wars and present themselves in the war when women and men were both were fighting. The discoveries also shattered the 150 years of misconception that was going on around the historians about how inferior the Indian civilization was. And Indian civilization was not much ahead or not much advanced if we talk about in aspect of the Harappan civilization that has gone from the India into the Pakistan, the region, and we as an Indian civilization has not got any evidence after the Harappan civilization. But the Sinhalese civilization has challenged all the late Harappan civilization, how advanced and how well equipped they were in the history. Well, the perception has been changed. That the pre-existing perception of the historians was changed dramatically, where the Sinoli changed much of their point of view to see history of the Indian massive culture with a whole new point of view. The Sinoli's excavation was one of the largest burial, as I have mentioned. 116 burials were found the site of the Asian subcontinent, which helped the historian to understand a better view of the Neolithic settlement of the subcontinent. The finding of the Sinoli has given out a new perspective to the historians and have opened new aspect and give an all new vision to look immensely into the significant history of the Sinoli in the Indian subcontinent. Well, in the conclusion, the main finding and the striking discoveries of the Sinoli was the horse, the chariot, the antled sword, the 116 burials which were found there, the orb-colored pottery. Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to present.
Okay. Um, Thank you, Siraj. You spoke so well. It was lovely hearing you. So,
Thank
any
you.
question for Siraj?
I have.
Yes.
Yes.
Siraj, first of all, congratulations for this very interesting presentation. I'm like very glad to see a first year student doing so, and you presented in a very attractive way. I don't have a question, but just one comment. Uh, you used a word warring clans, and
Sorry, can you just repeat it?
you used the word warring clan.
Warrior clan, I
Warrior
mentioned.
clan. Okay,
Yes,
warrior
yes,
clan.
yes.
So, uh, I have just one kind of a doubt on in this aspect,
Hmm.
that simply the presence of armaments or burials may not imply that a clan was warrior in nature, because in that sense we are following a very colonial uh, methodology of labeling certain clan as warrior or a peaceful or whatever. But I feel that if there were certain society, they had certain requirements, they had certain struggles, they need armaments, but that does not imply that a society was warrior in nature. So it's just my comment, and this could be even think further.
Mhm. Actually, I would say that the amount in which the all the tools and the shield and were found signifies and give us a conception wherein we can present this Sonoli as a warrior clan. But still, as we are in a dilemma wherein the Harappan script have not been deciphered, so we cannot accept the conception of a warrior clan being 100% right. But still, we can make something out of it. Like the chariot was also found, the Andrew sword was also found in much abundance rather than in Harappan civilization, and in a rather complete form, wherein the hilt was also present in that. Thirdly, the shield was also found, and the thing is that they were found in such an abundance that we cannot neglect the fact that these can be the clan which was participating in the war at an immense large scale. So this give a perspective wherein we can adjust our conception and make it like think that this was a warrior clan in aspects.
Interesting. You can deliberate upon this even further upon, and even look at the aspect if while making burials, the practice the these armaments rather represent certain kind of a social practice associated with burials. You can even more deliberate upon this aspect.
Okay, thank
So
you.
thank you so much, Siraj.
Thank you.
Okay.
Saurabh, you wanted to ask something?
Uh, Actually, I want to ask on Shagni, but seeing that we have actually extended a lot of time, I think I'll refrain and we should like conclude.
All right. Would you like to say something? Just comment on today's event?
The Shagnick is not here also.
Yeah,
Uh,
Shagnick is
I
not
am
there.
here right now.
Okay, okay.
Okay.
Got that.
From Itihāsa. Okay.
uh, no, actually, the presentation were very well. Okay, so I'll then ask my question in itself on the revolutionary France. So the concept was that what Shagnick was trying to portray was that there was this rupture of revolutionary France in terms of popular culture, where the revolutionary leaders wanted to uh, create a different and a distinct culture from the ancien regime. To what extent is that really true? Because what we saw that in the later periods, there was not actually a rupture, but was rather rather a situation of continuity and change, as implied by Tocqueville. Though Tocqueville focuses only on the political aspect of it, uh, could you comment more on this notion of continuity and change from the ancien regime to the revolutionary France
Yes,
in terms of popular culture?
I have a theory about that. So like from what I think of it, when the revolution was starting out, the people were more kind of idealistic. Their thoughts were more like utopian. So they thought that in the new France that they were creating, there should be a new kind of popular culture distinct from the ancien regime. But I think that since the government or the society, the culture in revolutionary France was so unstable from all points of view, they could not really succeed in creating something new. They did create many new things, and many things survived. To like, there were changes in cuisine that survived. There were uh, there were, yeah, so there were many kind of changes which survived, but there were changes that did not survive too, like changes in clothing. So you see, for that particular point of time when we have that revolutionary time period, during that particular point of time we have a different kind of clothing. People are wearing more cheaper, more lightweight kind of clothes. But once Napoleon comes and establishes the first empire, then people again go back to the earlier habits, earlier kind of culture. So it's like that. Like, over time we realized that what was existent before was more practical, because not everyone would agree to live in a shared culture. Some people would obviously in a society have more money, they would want more extravagant luxurious thing, they would want to distinguish their class from the others. So that is my theory about it.
Okay.
I think, Saurabh, don't you think there were phases of change and
Yes,
continuity?
ma'am. This is why it
Yeah.
is important to go into
Hmm.
specificity. But
Yeah.
I understand like what Shagnick says. There was some phases, but a little specificity would have been better.
Yeah.
But anyways, we can
I couldn't
continue
go
with the
into
present
much detail actually
event.
because of the time constraint. Otherwise, I would have liked to go to that. The thing is, I was covering popular culture from a broader perspective. I was not focusing on any one branch of popular culture, so that is why I think I couldn't go into much detail.
Okay. Um, Anyone else want to ask some question? Okay, with that, we come to the end of our event. And surely this evening gave us all a lot to think about, plus added so much value to our gray cells, right? Knowledge of history is such a blessing for mankind to really explore Terra Incognita. And thank you, all of you who has joined us today. And before that, I would like to call upon Miss Neeru to wrap up this event by saying few words. Ma'am, please.
All right. Thank you, Riya. It was a wonderful afternoon, from the evolution of Apple to the site discussed by Siraj, from Kumbh Mela to popular culture, and the, the very, very fascinating paper by Chandrima on paintings. And so I think many times people, when I tell them I teach history, the immediate reaction is, we never liked history because it was only dates and it's only battles. And I think today's afternoon has answered the question how fascinating history is, and it's not just dates. And how we can, there is so much more to it. It's one of the most rich subjects which has come up, which we have. Siraj, it was a very, very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Very well done. I liked your confidence and the challenge that you took up to present the paper.
Thank you, ma'am.
Anchit, as usual, you were very, very good. And, to bring Thar alive was, it was very, very creditable. Tejaswi, yesterday when in the evening we were talking about today's paper presentation, how interestingly you brought to life the Kumbh Mela, and what struck me while you all were presenting these papers was, there are so many things we just take for granted, but as students of history, how you have given them a, a history and a historical perspective to it. Chandrima, we still need to have one more session on the Daniels. I
Yes, ma'am.
loved the paintings and the juxtaposition of the painting with what actually exists. So beautifully done. So we are definitely going to have one more session on that. Shagnick, as usual, the thorough historian, wants maximum time with all that he has read, and it was very, very interesting. Saurabh, thank you so much, for always being there for the department. And Ritvik has left, but what a fascinating journey Ritvik also has had as a student, and when he kind of moved from history to science, there were these people who were asking him and questioning his credibility, but then he kind of was able to answer and satisfy them that today there he is doing his PhD, and again, the possibilities that are there with history, numerous, from paintings to Thar to a site to Kumbh Mela, how much we can cover. So thank you so much for Riya being an excellent host, and sparing your time. It was a well spent afternoon. Wish you all the very, very best. And it was Anchit, Saurabh, Chandrima, a special thank you for being wonderful alumni of the department. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure meeting the three of you today. And of course, Siraj, I met for the first time. Riya and Shagnick, I meet every time. And Tejaswi is our most dependable. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much, ma'am.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Riya.
you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
ma'am. Thank you
Thank
so much, Anyway, it's nice meeting you. It's so nice meeting you all. Have a good
Absolutely.
evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.